So there we go. Any declarations of interest? Nobody's got their hand up, so no declarations of interest. That's fine. So we'll just get straight on in there because there's a lot of interesting stuff on here today. And we're on to item 3, blue carbon in Highland, a presentation by Catriona Jarrett, is it? From Scottish Government, and Bill Austin from St Andrews University. So we'll just hand over directly to you. And are you going to be sharing your screen? Have you got presentation slides?
Yes, I am, thank you. I'll just share my screen now.
Yeah, welcome, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting myself and Bill to speak to you today. I'm delighted that the Highland Council is taking a keen interest in blue carbon and the green recovery. I'm Catriona Jarrett from Marine Scotland, which is part of the Scottish Government. I'm the policy lead for marine climate change and the Secretariat for the Scottish Blue Carbon Forum. I'm sure you're all aware that climate change is caused by emissions of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, etc. Climate change is causing a rise in global temperature and other impacts such as ocean warming, ocean acidification, and deoxygenation. Sea level rise is happening as a result of melting polar ice and also thermal expansion of seawater. Higher sea levels will start to encroach in our land and built environment, and storm events are expected to bring more severe and frequent flooding. Dealing with climate change typically comes in 2 forms: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation aims to reduce or offset emissions to slow and stop climate change. Adaptation aims to prepare us for the changes that are already locked in. Blue carbon can help us with elements of both of these. Although we are currently unable to use blue carbon in national carbon accounting, we are learning more about how much carbon is stored in our seas and what actions can help or hinder carbon sequestration. So this box just outlines some of the key things that blue carbon can help us with. Blue carbon has many definitions, ranging from a narrow list of habitats that can be used in carbon accounting to including all carbon that is stored in the marine environment. The Scottish Blue Carbon Forum considers a number of habitats that act as carbon stores, which, if damaged and disturbed, may release carbon. These include, but are not limited to, salt marsh, seagrass, biogenic reefs, and mud. Bill is going to speak to us a little bit more about some mud and salt marsh. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change advises that only salt marsh and seagrass can be accounted for in emissions inventories for a number of reasons. But if we consider the wider benefits of blue carbon habitats, we should not limit ourselves to only looking at the bottom line of our carbon calculations. The benefits of blue carbon habitats, by the Blue Carbon Forum definition anyway, include but are not limited to supporting biodiversity, acting as fish nursery grounds, protecting against coastal erosion and flooding, which is a key element of climate adaptation. This can support the charismatic megafauna, for example, dolphins and birds, that is a key draw to ecotourists and particularly important in the Highlands. The Scottish Government is focused on a green recovery from COVID. The recently published Climate Change Plan update is the first publication outlining our ambitions here. We are also developing a Blue Economy Action Plan, which will focus on building back our economy in a sustainable way, supporting a just transition to net zero. Damage and disturbance of blue carbon habitats may release carbon, but as discussed earlier, it's not all about emissions. Considering blue carbon as part of a green or blue recovery and protecting the ecosystem services they deliver is vital to a resilient society. There is a role for blue carbon in our Blue Economy Action Plan. At an individual level, we've developed closer connections with local areas as a result of lockdown and staycations. While supporting the recovery of our tourist industry is also very important for our economy, we mustn't forget to build on the lessons from lockdown and promote Scotland as a destination for locals and encourage locals to love the nature they live amongst. This should be an easier task than elsewhere in the UK in the famously beautiful Highlands. This will benefit health, well-being and land management. Having a healthy natural environment will encourage ecotourism, and particularly as the public opinion is shifting to be more environmentally conscious, businesses will be encouraged to invest back into nature and the local economy. A perfect example of this is the DEEP project that I'll discuss in a moment. So what can a local authority do for blue carbon? I won't cover marine planning partnerships, as I understand that discussion is ongoing. While benthic habitats below the high water mark belong to the Crown Estate, actions on land and activities carried out by citizens based in the local authority area can still impact blue carbon habitats. For example, fertiliser can wash into rivers and out to sea, impacting these habitats. You can engage with landowners, managers and users that around the coast and that are active around the coast and waterways to promote best practice. The RSPCA manage a number of wetland sites in the Highlands, and I'm sure they would be very happy to advise of some key actions that would benefit their local sites. There are opportunities to include blue carbon education in schools, including visits to the coast and local salt marsh reserves. Businesses and trade can be encouraged to invest in blue carbon projects to offset their activities and improve their green credentials. Build your networks to find out what is already going on in your area and who might be able to share learning and support the development of similar projects. Encourage innovation and diversification. Oh dear, something's just happened to my screen. What is going on? Sorry, my screen just went black.
Have you inadvertently shared your screen?
I am very sorry, members.
Okay, we'll try again, Katrina.
I will see if we can bring that back. Is that working? Are we back?
Yeah, that's it. Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so innovation. You can encourage innovation and diversification in businesses that use or impact the marine space and demonstrate that investment in a healthy environment makes good business sense. The local authority won't necessarily be able to push all this forwards alone, but a process of engaging with exemplar projects to identify blockers, for example through the planning process, will help you to know where to go to get support. I'll now give a few examples of blue carbon projects happening in the Highlands that may have learning to share and enthusiasm to spare to support similar projects being set up. You may be aware of some of these already. They're quite well known. Glenmorangie Distillery installed some fancy equipment to purify the effluent from the distillery that was flowing out into the Dornoch Firth. It captured all but the remaining 5%. Dornoch Environmental Enhancement Project was originally designed to remove the final 5%. They've been restoring an ancient native oyster bed, which will capture the particulates flowing out from the distillery. Over time, the oysters will build a reef and layer up over their predecessors and the sediment they have captured. This will become a carbon sink, and one of the Blue Carbon Forum's researchers is working on this project to better understand the carbon flows. This project is a fantastic example of how a business can use environmental restoration as an investment. I've been informally advised by Glenmorangie that they've seen around 8 times return on their investment in terms of advertising revenue. So this is a genuine, solid business venture. Project Seagrass have launched their Seagrass Spotter tool. This is available globally for citizens to log sightings of seagrass. We're supporting Project Seagrass to set up in Scotland and increase their survey effort. This is a little snapshot from the Seagrass Spotter tool, and I don't know if you can see the numbers on your screens, but there's been quite a few sightings and surveys of seagrass around the Highlands. So this could be a ready-made project that could be promoted in local communities and schools with very little hard cash investment. Another local project, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is the NIG Coastal Realignment Project. While the role of the local authority is fairly clear in terms of planning and community engagement, it would be great to see more projects like this. So I would like to hear if there's anything the government could do to support the developments of projects like this. Thinking outside the box a little to projects not yet developed, could coastal industry use habitat restoration or creation, whether a classic blue carbon habitat or not, to increase climate resilience? For example, you can see how these fronds of kelp create the appearance of an underwater forest. Could we use kelp in aquaculture to slow wave action and reduce the impact of storm surges near vulnerable infrastructure? Could aquaculture farms be encouraged to diversify to grow kelp around their farms and reduce damage to fish cages? Could the local authority promote kelp as a product to drive interest? Finally, I would like to offer 2 opportunities for collaboration and support. We are hosting our Blue Carbon Conference as part of COP26. We'll be hosting it in Edinburgh and are currently developing our programme. We'll be focusing on bringing together researchers and policymakers and promoting best practice, while also considering where blue carbon fits in the bigger picture of climate mitigation and adaptation. We're partnering with St Andrews University and Glenmorangie, who are running the DEEP project, and Glenmorangie are sponsoring the evening reception. The First Minister has been clear that COP26 should be Scotland-wide, not just focused on Glasgow. So this is a great opportunity to promote the Highlands. If the Highland Council would like to develop a blue carbon project, ambitions, targets or partnerships and showcase the Highlands at the conference, this would be a perfect platform to promote it. Bill and I would be delighted to work with you. I'm also looking for projects, pilots and case studies to include in the Blue Economy Action Plan to showcase best practice and demonstrate action on the ground for either blue carbon or marine climate change. This could inspire similar projects, and it might be the same thing that you would want to promote at the COP26 conference. I would be happy to discuss either of these options with you and support further development. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Is Bill going to come in on that, or do we have any questions on that first, members? Councillor Fraser, before we go on, we'll go to some questions here. Councillor Fraser.
Yeah, if I remember rightly, we were discussing the blue carbon at our last meeting, and the RSPB are doing a great deal of work, and they've got, I think, an 11-point plan to promote environmental issues. The issue I have here, within that sort of document, NIG was mentioned, and I suppose I better mention that people that know me here, I'm a species champion for the bottlenose dolphin and the solitary bee. So once people become species champions, it's okay saying you're a species champion, but you need to champion the species you've chosen to champion. I shan't say that after I've had a few beers because it'd be difficult. But once people actually start to investigate what they've actually signed up to, you then start to have a different perspective. So I know about the blue carbon and through the RSPB and what have you. If I use I know there's a proposal to have a marine protected area from Helmsdale across to Lossy coming into Inverness. Within there we have a lot of the areas that you mentioned there, Catriona, such as the mole beds and the beds at Nig. My concern that we have, the other one, we also have Ramsar sites which are down at Udall Bay. Do we actually communicate with the Ramsar Secretariat? And I know that there's OSPA, we're in the northern region, I think it's Zone 1, Region 2 of OSPA, which comes into that area. My concern is that we have a wealth of natural resource in Highland, but we also have a requirement for sustainable coastal jobs, and sometimes that has a head-on conflict, and we need to be able to manage that successfully so we don't actually destroy the very thing that people want to come up here for, and the I can't think of the right words I was going to use there, but not to worry. We also have, as Highland Council, supplementary aquaculture planning guidance, and we have areas which are shellfish protected, such as along the Cromarty coast here. And so with all these bits and pieces, I know it's been a bit of an eclectic comment that I've made, because I didn't get the papers too late, which was my fault. But I'm sure you could pick up some bits within that.
Thank you, Craig. Councillor Howden.
Thanks very much. That was an interesting presentation. I'm councillor for Ward 7, which is Tane and Easter Ross. So two of the things you mentioned there are in my ward. At NIG, where maybe my fellow councillors won't know much about, that it was essentially land that at one time had been reclaimed from the sea, and the project was to basically to knock down the barrier to stop the sea getting in, and to restore the wetlands that had been there before. And I think that has had some support locally. It's a very flat area and very close to sea level. So I think there are some concerns locally that high tidal events that might pose risks to farmland and the population locally. So the second one that you mentioned, the Deep project with Glenmorangie, again is quite interesting from our point of view. Tane has a common good fund, and the main asset of the common good fund is the Tane mussel beds, which are coexisting at the moment with the demonstration project that Heriot Watt has managed for Glenmorangie. And there has recently been discussion over a huge expansion of that, and I know that there are plans in that area. And I think if the oyster project became a sort of 20-hectare scheme, as I think might be proposed, I think it would put the mockers on the Tane mussel fishery. So really we need to have some sort of discussion with Glenmorangie as to how those issues are managed so that they don't come into conflict. But generally I think we locally up to this point both these schemes have been supported.
Thank you. Councillor McInnes.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Trish, and thank you, Katrina, for your presentation. Really, really interesting. I was just going to mention that you went through quite a list there, and you also mentioned you were looking for potential partners going forward. So at the moment, just to kind of throw my hat in the ring, I'm from a family of seaweed harvesters from North Uist in the Western Isles. So we've been working seaweed for a long, long time. But we're involved in a SW Grow project, it's called, which is an EU-funded project. And that also is looking for partners. So what I might do is get back in touch with you and put you in contact with a number of people, if that would be acceptable.
That sounds like a great idea. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. And Councillor Rickson, and then we'll move on to Bill if he's got something here.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Katrina, very much for your presentation. You mentioned mill beds. Now, there are apparently extensive mill beds of Arisaig, and the reason that I bring it up is there has been concern on the West Coast for a while about the effects of dredging. Now, I've always been slightly open-minded about this because having done some diving in the past, I have seen the effects of clam dredging on the seabed. Yes, it does look devastating, but I've always wondered what the scientific view on this would be. Certainly, it leaves a lot of litter on the seabed, and the starfish have a wonderful time afterwards with the few clams that are remaining. But you know, we do these things on land. We plough fields up, and the aeration of the soil is often very beneficial. So I would be glad to, you know, learn more about it from your point of view as to the effects of dredging on the land, on the seabed. The reason being that it is quite an emotive issue, and I live in a fishing port, and people do still make their living from dredging. I believe that some of the newest methods are actually far more environmentally friendly and involve brushing rather than dredging, but it is still an issue. And of course, that's also come up slightly further north from us in the Loch Carron area and some of these rare shells and so on. But I think this is sort of an important issue and one that affects livelihoods, because of course, if we ban dredging, people will still want scallops, and that involves people diving for them. And unfortunately, when you have people diving for scallops, you have a higher death rate. It's as simple as that. There are more human casualties. The other thing that I wanted to touch on was the big business of aquaculture and kelp farming and so on. And we did have a proposal a couple of years ago where a firm from Ayrshire was, I think, actually in receipt of money from HIE to research the effects of kelp farming on the West Coast. And a campaign to knock back any sort of mechanized kelp farming was very quickly mounted and became very emotive extremely quickly. I'm open-minded about this because I think kelp farming could offer a future industry on the West Coast. And one of the reasons for that, and I was very interested to hear what Councillor McInnes said, is that go back 200 years and there was a huge kelp farming industry in the Highlands, and that sustained a lot of people for a long time. And seemingly without much effect on the environment. And we might say, oh, well, nobody thought about the environment at the time, but actually that wouldn't be true. The old statistical accounts and new statistical accounts are full of information about the environmental concerns which concerned people at the time. So two different things there. Merle beds is one and aquaculture is the other. I'm sure there'll be endless discussions about both of them. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. Katrina, do you want to come back on those?
Yes, I will briefly. I'm aware that you're quite tight on time, but on the merle bed issue, so obviously merle bed habitats do appear to be visibly damaged when they're trawled over, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the position should obviously be trawling is banned or dredging is banned. These things do need to be done as part of taking account of the livelihoods that rely on them, and that is part of the blue economy approach. So Merle is a priority marine feature, which means we need to try and look after it. We don't necessarily know where they all are, but I'm absolutely not proposing that we are considering banning dredging. I just want to make that clear now. And if an MPA is designated for Merle, then obviously activities that damage the Merle in that MPA would be managed. But I'm not familiar with a particular area you're talking about, if it's in an MPA or not. But yeah, I'm sure that's not a discussion we need to come into now. Your second point on seaweed, so there's a difference between harvesting wild seaweed, and there's been a lot of activity. Really, it's quite a sensitive topic, as I'm aware, over the last year or so. What I was suggesting in my talk was the cultivation of it in a manner that slows wave action. So not necessarily harvesting or encouraging wild growth, but actual cultivation in a way to protect infrastructure and using the fast growth rates of kelp in that way. So that's what I'd been thinking about. So again, two very different issues there. But thank you very much for all of your comments. I'll take those on board and look forward to hearing from you, Alexander. Okay,
Bill, do you have a presentation or a bit shortchanged here?
No, I do. Thank you, Councillor Robertson. Joe, I think, is going to drive for me. So Joe, if you could put the slides up, that would be great. And I'll just say next slide when we're ready.
Oh, sorry, I actually sent it through to Keith. I don't have it readily available just now. I can just have a quick look for it, unless, Keith, you have it to hand.
2 seconds.
If not, I can try and share my screen. I'm
No,
used to
don't
doing
worry.
that.
I will
Okay.
be
God's will
up
get
and
Thanks, Keith.
my computer plays ball. Do you want to just introduce yourself just now, Bill, and I'll get this.
Yes.
loaded
Okay.
up.
Well, first of all, thanks to Katrina. That was a great introduction, and I have to say I really enjoyed the level of questioning from your group. I think some really key questions there about the management of the marine environment. Dennis, I think some of the questions you asked are particularly relevant at the moment in the debate on how we manage our shelf seas in particular. And whilst I'm going to talk about blue carbon, oh, thank you. Okay, well, I'll just go into the talk then, if that's okay.
That's great, thanks.
Are you able to, is that full screen for everyone? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to talk about blue carbon resources. My group at St Andrews work quite closely with Scottish Government. We also work more broadly with UK Research Funding Council. I have links to the Marine Laboratory at Oban, and I've also got some collaborative networks with Marine Planning and Policy and Katrina through in Edinburgh. The work that we do is about contributing to Scotland's climate change planning. So that's the element of blue carbon that connects to the inventory work. But as Katrina said, you know, the work of the Scottish Blue Carbon Forum is also to consider these resources beyond the greenhouse gas inventory accounting. And this is where I think the broader nature climate debate comes into play. I'd like to acknowledge support for this work from Craig Smeaton, Paulina Ruranska, Lucy Miller, and Simone Regal. They work in and around the theme of blue carbon at St Andrews. The map, just out of interest, is the British Geological Survey's current understanding of sediment distribution across our shelf seas. So, and the extended exclusive economic zone there out to Rockall. You know, so already there are bits of our shelf seas that we don't completely understand. Some of these, of course, adjacent to the Highland Council area. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background to these salt marsh habitats and to set the scene for blue carbon. So about 83% of the global carbon cycle is involved in our oceans. These habitats, however, only cover 2% of the ocean area, yet their sediments hold about 50% of the carbon that's connected to carbon sequestration. So that drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere becomes extremely important in these places. Next slide, please. In terms of the sequestration rates, the amount of carbon per meter square per year, these habitats are far more effective than forests. So we know, and we focus quite rightly on afforestation as a way of helping with climate change and carbon and climate mitigation. But actually these places, tidal marshes and seagrass meadows in the Scottish context, are very effective places when we normalize for area. So area for area, these are great places to be thinking about doing climate mitigation work. Next slide, please. As well as the sequestration, there is also an important long-term carbon store in the soils, in the below ground carbon stores with these ecosystems. Now, the analogy here that I think Highland would be very familiar with, of course, is the peatland resource that you have. And in a very similar way, in fact, the annual sequestration rates for peatlands are quite low. Their real value, I think, lies in those long-term stores that have taken hundreds, if not thousands of years to accumulate carbon. And of course, they can be very vulnerable to the loss of carbon. And the same applies to these coastal habitats that we're talking about here. If they're not well managed, they can very quickly release large amounts of carbon back to the atmosphere. And of course, this has to be part of the way that we focus on managing our carbon resources. Next slide, please. So I've been leading as part of a wider UK project, but two photographs here, one from Morich Moor on the left and the other up in Sutherland at the head of the Kyle of Tongue with Ben Loyal in the background there. And what we've been doing is visiting sites around the coastline and building up an understanding, a first order understanding of the carbon that's stored in these places. And remarkably, we had very little understanding of how much carbon was stored in these places until very recently. Next slide, please. Now, the reason that we're interested in these carbon stores loops back to the climate change plan and the implementation of new habitats into the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And what we have here in our coastal salt marshes in particular, because they are quite well mapped, they've been mapped by Nature Scotland, and we've been working to understand the stores of carbon, is that we can implement these habitats into the inventory using some fairly standard approaches where there is an international framework and agreement. So this is one habitat where there is scope for their incorporation to help with national greenhouse gas accounting. Next slide, please. Well, this is actually up in the Dornoch area. This is the marsh at Dornoch. And the inclusion of salt marshes into the UK greenhouse gas inventory would, I would argue, provide an important first step necessary to account for, protect, and restore these long-term carbon stores. And this would realize, of course, the potential for climate change mitigation, but at the same time, enhance the policy mechanisms for their protection and their good management. And I should say that it's very clear in the post-Brexit world and the environment in which we're going to manage land in the UK, across the UK, that there will be incentives and opportunities for improved management of these resources. So, this is, I think, a good area for you to be looking at in terms of its potential and contribution, as you do with your peatlands, to Scotland's net zero targets. Next slide, please. So we've been doing some work, commissioned work for Marine Scotland, and I just wanted to show you here, these habitats are widely distributed. They're widely distributed, of course, in the Highland Council area, as well as throughout Scotland. Next slide, please. And in terms of your ranking, I'm sure you're interested in the overall ranking in a Scottish context. You are number 2 for this habitat type. I think you're number 1 for your peatlands, but you're right up there with the extent of this habitat and the tons of carbon. This is unpublished data that I'm sharing here. And what we see is quite a large store of carbon, and this is just the surface soil. So this is just the top 10 centimeters that we've currently been able to sample and upscale. And the other observation I would make here that will encourage you, I think, and we've been talking to Joe about opportunities to develop this approach, is that we know that marshes in the Highland area in particular are quite small and fragmented beyond the large marsh systems. And this approach that we've used is based, as I've said, on a SNH, Nature Scotland, mapping of habitats across Scotland with a threshold of 3 hectares. So all those small marshes that are going to hold additional carbon are not yet included in these assessments. And so I think there's an opportunity to engage with local stakeholders, local rangers, and build up a better picture of this habitat. Okay, next slide, please. So I've been working as part of a wider group across the UK, looking at a whole range of what we call nature-based solutions. You'll appreciate, I'm certain, that there's a great gearing up of interest ahead of COP26 in Glasgow in November. And, you know, some of the points that I would make is that these nature-based solutions are not an alternative to decarbonize our economy. So I think all of us would appreciate that. They do need to encompass protection, restoration, and sustainable management of a wide range of ecosystems. And I think I'm offering you salt marsh habitats as an option here to begin with. They have to be designed with and for local communities. So I think some of the questions that you had for Katrina really resonating there. And of course, we want them to deliver measurable benefits for biodiversity, because we know that healthy ecosystems are actually going to be very effective places for carbon storage and carbon sequestration. Next slide, please. So a final thought is that blue carbon offers an emerging opportunity to support the UK government, devolved administrations, and I think on the ground, Highland Council and the opportunity to work with you here is very exciting. In what I would describe as a political commitment to a nature covenant, we're not just focused on carbon, as Katrina said. We want to tackle these multiple issues, and in this case, twin issues of climate change and biodiversity. And there are great opportunities because these sites are accessible, they're in our coastal environments, to engage with young people and stakeholder groups. This is an example when we met with the Minister for the Natural Environment, Marie Goujon, who came to engage with a citizen science program with young children, this example from the Montrose Basin. And in this case, these samples are part of the data collection process in those maps that I've just shown you. And I think we could help you. We'd be very happy to work with you to set up this kind of citizen science program, perhaps with the help of your rangers around you know, the expansive coastline of Highland. And of course, you know, picking up on that tourist idea of travel, these are environments where you could also engage visitors to this habitat type. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. Happy to take some questions.
That was extremely interesting, and it's certainly put my given me a lot more information about the various aspects and things that we should be looking into. I think you'll agree, members. Does anybody have any questions on this? Councillor Rickson.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks very much indeed, Bill, for the presentation. It was really fascinating. Only one thing I was going to ask you about. You said that Nature Scott have mapped the sort of areas of salt marsh quite well, that map already exists. I think from a sort of practical point of view, I would be really interested to see a map of those areas which we could potentially rewild or reflood. I know that there's a lot of interest in other parts of the UK and equally well on the continent at sort of abandoning land back to the sea again. And of course, I do understand that you're working against several hundred years of history here. You know, every time an agriculturalist sees a piece of flat land, the first thing he wants to do is drain it. And in a way, what we're thinking about here is perhaps it would be better if we allowed it to become waterlogged again. So it would be really interesting from the long-term point of view if we could have an indication of where you thought that this might be possible. We hear a lot about rewilding. I have to say I'm not in favour of bringing wolves back to Scotland, but I am really taken with the idea that there are places where we could perhaps allow salt marshes a bit more room, where perhaps we could expand, perhaps we could abandon some waterlogged fields and just allow some of what you've suggested there. But thanks very much, greatly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you. I'll just respond very quickly to Professor Councillor Rickson. I think that's a great point. It's certainly something that we can project with the sea level estimates for change over time. And one of the things that we are doing actually is working on this question. And so it is a question about how much land would potentially fall into those categories for managed realignment. And I'm also working with the Environment Agency, who are developing some new methods for these kind of realignment schemes. But certainly if you looked at Google Earth around the NIG reserve area as an example, you know, the extent of reclamation, it becomes very obvious when you look at those sorts of images of our coastline. So I agree with you, you know, historically, there has been, you know, a large loss of this habitat around the UK.
Thank you. Councillor Loudon there, please.
Yes, yeah. Having looked at one side of the Tarbert Peninsula at Nig, we're now switched to the other side, and you're down on the Morich Moor. So yeah, again, interesting to see your own ward through other people's eyes. Yeah, interesting to see what the what your take on the Morich Moor was. That's another area where I think, as Dennis is saying, a lot of effort's probably gone in over the years to put the drainage in. A lot of that area is protected largely because it's been first a naval and then an Air Force and now I think an Army base. So it hasn't maybe had the highest level of activity that you would get in other areas, but interesting to see what the proposal was there. And Dennis is very welcome to come and visit the Nig area at any time, or the Morich Moor, for an exemplar for letting the sea back in. I'm not sure that all the farmers are entirely happy, as I think you were suggesting, and I think that maybe is an issue too. It's on the areas that are flooded. How do the adjoining adjacent landowners, what assurance will they be given that that could be looked after?
Okay, Bill.
Thank you, Councillor Loudon. Yeah, I think a good point there. I mean, we're not at a place yet where I think we have practical management interventions for some of these schemes. We have somebody within the forum who's working on the socioeconomic aspects and valuations. As I say, I think there are green finance opportunities on the horizon where those alternatives and the economic implication to farming that land, will need to be brought into the mix. But I think there are some good opportunities there. And if we can implement these habitats into the national inventory, that will drive an incentive for these sorts of schemes. I mean, it's often marginal land, and I think there are some great opportunities to think about alternative uses of that type of marginal land across all agricultural sectors.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd really welcome the opportunity to speak to you on that subject. Thanks.
Dennis, are you coming in to accept Derek's invitation, or have you got something else to add?
Thank you, Chair. It was merely to say to Derek, I have relatives who are farmers in precisely that area, so I take his point. But Chair, if I could just add in, both Bill and Derek have mentioned the same word in different areas, which is Morich. And I think I'm right in saying that that's from the Gaelic for a seaplane. So in a way, what you're doing is you're incorporating place names which Gaels used in centuries past to describe precisely these sort of areas of land. But I wait to be corrected by Councillor McInnes, whose knowledge of Gaelic is far more extensive than mine, but I just throw it in there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dennis. And Councillor Fraser, please.
Yeah, it's just picking up on various points from Dennis and Derek. More and more landowners, farmers in particular, are actually, I have to be careful how I word this, waking up or realising that to get involved with environmental concerns can actually have a benefit to them, both financial and spiritual. And then we bring in the children in the schools. So what I'm trying to say is that if we work on problem, reaction, solution, we know what the problem is, global warming, and the reaction is when we as either local authorities or governments, doesn't matter whether it's here or elsewhere in the world, come up with solutions that we think will work. The solution is then how do we communicate that to the very people that have the ability to enact what our vision is. And I think the only way you can do that is to really get round the table with the landowners that have the ability to get on board with us and give them a steer and a hand as to why it is so important. And because once you've actually done that, you can see with we've lost a lot of our hedgerows over the years. It's run into probably 80% of our hedgerows over the years, and our meadowlands have disappeared. And to get that back is going to take a long time. But if we engage with the landowners to say, this is why you should do it, and this is how we can help you as a collaborative working, I think we can bring them with us rather than say, this is what we're going to do. You've lost a few hectares of your foreshore, which you may have been wanting for barley. So we need to have that discussion with them. It's probably going on already. But I think once we've actually had that discussion and say, look, we need your help to be part of the solution, I think we'll be able to progress this in a more collaborative way. We're probably doing that anyway, but.
Okay, thank you, Craig. Bill, do you want to come back on that?
I think just to thank you, Councillor Fraser. I think, you know, that's exactly the point. We need to look for the wins for everybody here, and I think there are wins. And I think increasingly government recognises the need to put mechanisms in place to help fund. And so I think Katrina's point about the opportunities through the blue recovery and so on, you know, those are going to be things to keep looking at and to work with. But, you know, we need these schemes to start to work on the ground. And so, you know, we've been very encouraged to have the opportunity to speak to you today. And, you know, we'd like to take that forward, of course, in my case, in terms of the science and the evidence, and I think in terms of Katrina's interests, in terms of the policy opportunities. So, you know, thank you for letting us present.
Thank you for your presentations. They're very interesting and giving us a lot to think about. And I think we can agree, members, that this is something we have to look into a bit more to see if we can do as much for these habitats as we are trying to do for the peatlands as we move forward. So can I ask you to note the presentation and food for thought and come back with more ideas about how we can implement some of this stuff. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your time today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. So after that very interesting start, we're on to yet another way of helping a little bit with our low carbon solutions, item 4, and we have a presentation at the meeting by Sonia Wayman, who's one of our landscape architects at the council. Sonia, are you with us?
Yeah, hello. I'll just try and share my screen. Thank you. I'll just try and share my presentation. So I'm not sure that's worked, has it? Can you see it?
Yes, yes, it's there. Thank you.
So you can see my screen. I'll just get it up and running. Okay. My mouse will work. Okay. So you can still see the slideshow.
Yes, you're fine.
Yeah, right, that's fine. Okay, so hello, firstly, and thank you for inviting me here today to talk to you about how low carbon solutions in green infrastructure can help to tackle the climate emergency. So the purpose of this presentation is to raise awareness of how we can incorporate these solutions in future projects, and also to highlight where we have made headway in doing so in our day-to-day work. And I hope it will begin a dialogue with colleagues across services to help find ways of overcoming obstacles to progress as well. So firstly, I'd like to just give you an introduction as to who we are and where we sit within the organisation. So there are 2 landscape architects within the design consultancy, myself and Claire Bell, and we work alongside the architects, and the design consultancy is part of the Property and Housing Service. And then also to give some background context, I'd like to draw attention to the Landscape Institute's Climate and Biodiversity Action Plan. So the Landscape Institute is the professional body representing the landscape profession, and in June 2019, it declared a climate and biological diversity emergency. And as part of this declaration, it committed to improving its members' awareness of the actions they can take to help tackle these twin emergencies. And the publication of the action plan in May 2020 was a direct response to this commitment, and it serves to outline its mission and areas for action. So one of the actions identified in the plan was to update our code of practice, which now explicitly makes reference to the climate emergency. And the plan also seeks to promote key areas of development to better equip its members. And these were understanding the emergency as a framework, translating it into practice, fostering skills in collaboration, and also measuring impact, and this, for example, by industry set standards. So a couple of these standards are shown on this slide. So that's BREEAM, which is a recognised sustainability assessment method for master planning projects, infrastructure and buildings. And also a relatively new one is Building with Nature, which is accreditation for the quality of design and management in green infrastructure. So in responding to the emergency, we understand and acknowledge that landscapes are multifunctional, and they have the ability to provide food and energy, water storage and flood mitigation, as well as providing a valuable resource for biodiversity and promoting health and well-being. So the holistic approach in landscape design and management means that our profession has a responsibility for environmental stewardship, and sustainable design and management are essential if we're to adapt our environments to a changing climate and mitigate future change. So the landscape responses offer a range of mitigation and adaptation principles, many of which are interlinked and are mutually reinforcing. So it's these solutions which are critical to the creation of environments that are robust and flexible to climate change. And I'd like to cover these in the next few slides. So obviously mitigation, these are covered with large-scale intervention and site-specific intervention and working practices. So starting with large scale, this relates to master plans and strategies, and it looks at the whole site in context and will include topography and microclimate, but also the site's connections to the wider landscape. It can also look at what measures can be made to encourage more sustainable lifestyles, such as improving public health through green travel, for example, and also maximising local food production. And then site-specific interventions, this can be the creation of carbon sinks, which obviously remove carbon from the atmosphere, such as tree planting, and also measures that can improve thermal efficiency of buildings by regulating temperature extremes, for example, green roofs. The use of open space for renewable energy options, switching to less intensive green space management, for example, meadows rather than mown grass, And then also our working practices, so local sustainable sourcing of construction materials, so timber, for example, that's responsibly sourced. And a lot of hard landscaping now is using recycled content. And then also procurement of contractual services from organisations which demonstrate their effectiveness in the measures they are taking to minimise carbon intensity of capital works and site management activities. So following on from mitigation, we then look at adaptation and the role of green spaces and green infrastructure. So looking at the definitions, green spaces are obviously areas of vegetated open space that can vary in scale from a few street trees to a regional park. And we define green infrastructure as this network of green spaces, and it provides many wide-ranging benefits, which can include promoting healthy living, reducing flood risk, improving air and water quality, encouraging walking and cycling, and enhancing biodiversity and ecological resilience. So green infrastructure plays a critical role in increasing capacity to adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change. So the consequences of climate change or the changes in our climate are obviously well known and I'm sure well understood by the working group. And in the case of green space adaptation, the measures can be broadly categorised into flooding, temperature rise and biodiversity changes. So looking at flooding, one of the major consequences of the predicted changes in climate is the increased risk of flooding and an increase in the frequency and intensity of flooding incidents. So sustainable urban drainage, or SUDS, offers the opportunity to reduce the water flow in our drains and sewers and to act to minimise the risk of flooding and pollution. So the way it does this is through attenuation and storage so that the water is held back for longer and avoids incidents of intense surface water drainage. So it can include features such as swales and ponds, and also rain gardens. Vegetation helps to intercept the rainwater, permeable surfaces. And also these features, they have the added benefit of creating habitats for biodiversity. Then moving on to temperature rises, the greener towns and cities help to reduce the urban heat island effect by cooling our urban environment, and green space can significantly cool buildings by providing respite by offering shade and maintaining air quality. So we will likely also need to review our plant species selection to allow for more drought tolerant species, as well as potential for more pests and diseases. And we're also looking at grey water as well for irrigation, because as our climate becomes hotter and drier summers, then there'll be pressure on our conventional supplies. And lastly, the biodiversity changes. Actions should be designed to help species adapt to such as conservation of key sites and ensuring that our green infrastructure is well connected to allow wildlife corridors for species to migrate in the face of climate change. So I have a couple of examples of recent projects which illustrate some of the work we're already doing to assist with combating climate change, and also to discuss some of the challenges that we have encountered. So the site of the former Akintour School, after many years of dereliction and being registered on the Building at Risk Register, has now been brought back into use as council offices, and it's known as the Charles Kennedy Building. So the measures to enhance biodiversity were incorporated into the proposal and include low maintenance areas of wildflowers, which form the transition between the close mown grass and the hedge line boundaries. The planting aims to extend broadleaf woodland and encourage a mixed age stand of native trees and shrubs. And we also look to treat the invasive species such as Japanese knotweed and rhododendron, which have been controlled, and there's an ongoing programme of treatment for recurring growth as well. So the photographs here show quite a good before and after, and the image on the right shows the wildflower mix that was used, and that's the first year when the building was open. the original brief for the landscaping was to create an outdoor space for staff that would also double up as a setting for events such as weddings associated with the registry office in the building. And since completion, staff at the office have set up a food growing project called Good Grub within the courtyard, and planters have been installed and filled with produce to promote a sort of more sustainable lifestyle. And fruit trees have also been successfully relocated from nearby St Mary's Primary School, which was due for demolition, and these were planted in the lawn on phase 2 of the project, which now houses HIE and the Archive Centre, and that's down on the bottom left of the plan there. So the second project I'd like to look at is Inches Park. And the image here is the master plan for phases 2 and 3 of the project, which extends from Stevenson Road in the north down to Milton of Leys in the south. And our broad aims were to improve community access and maximise the potential for informal recreation, and also to provide a flexible layout that can accommodate a phased development of the site and enhance natural strengths of the landscape, and also support biodiversity through planting of appropriate native trees and shrubs. So the project consists of 32.5 hectares of new park, and it's been developed in 3 phases as developer contributions accrue. And phase 1 was complete in 2012. Phase 2 of the civil works have now been completed, which include an all abilities off-road path, which was part funded through the South Strand Spaces for Everyone programme. And the route links communities to education, employment, health, retail and recreation destinations. And the continuation of the path in phase 3 is currently out to tender. SUDS drainage solutions have been adopted on the site to include swales, and there's a porous car park surface. There's also an existing SUDS pond, attenuation pond, which was installed as part of the surrounding housing developments. And as phases 2 and 3 are still in early stages of development, there's been no work to date on the landscaping, with the exception of just the reinstatement works from the off-road path. And the entrance plaza that has been shown here in the photo, although that's installed, the associated planting that goes with it hasn't been yet to date. So because Inches Park's quite a new park, there are quite a few opportunities to include some of the interventions that we looked at earlier. And some of these have already been incorporated into the work, such as the green travel route and the SUDS measures. But the list of items here that I have on this slide, they're not exhaustive, but they give a brief outline of some of the issues that we can come up against. So the first one, site intervention, food growing. The park's very close to Inches Primary School, so there's an opportunity there for educational use, but the constraint is security, because there's been some vandalism problems on the site. And then moving on to green travel and the Places for Everyone programme. The constraint on this one has been the very steep nature of the site. So it's trying to get balance an all abilities route with minimising the earthworks and also the habitat disturbance on the site. Carbon sinks would be more woodland creation and landscaping, but the availability of sufficient funding is really the constraint on that one. Then there's renewable energy. It's probably possible to even light the park by renewable sources, but that we'd need to look at funding and project feasibility for that as well. And I've also put in for site-specific interventions awareness raising. And although this wasn't listed as a particular site-specific intervention earlier, it is one that Green Space Scotland use, because it encouraging people with more sustainable lifestyles can be a way of mitigating, climate change interventions. So, but the constraint here I have is community aspirations may not match the climate change agenda. So as there's a Inches Community Association with an interest in developing projects in phase 2 of the site, so community buy-in is of particular importance. So I think community-led projects would also need to meet the objectives of embedding low carbon solutions, and that would need to be set out in a park strategy. And then the other two items here in working practices, procurement. There's a possibility of contract growing so that we have greater control over nursery stock and the supplier's environmental policies. But the constraints are timescales, and advanced planning would be required to do that. And then also local and sustainable sourcing of construction materials. So that would be purchasing of site furniture, for example. The constraint can be that there's a limited availability of products, and they may not meet the requirements. So a timber bin might not be the right capacity, and it might not be vandal resistant. So I wanted to draw special attention to one site-specific intervention, which is switching to less intensive green space management. And in this example is creating a perennial wildflower meadow rather than mown grass. So in establishing a perennial wildflower meadow, we need to ensure the soil's low fertility so that wildflowers can outcompete the grass. The ground preparation usually requires 2 treatments of herbicide to clear perennial weeds. There's a very specific maintenance regime, so 1 to 2 cuts, and so 1 in the spring and usually followed by the 1 in September once the seeds have set. And it's important that the arisings are removed in order to maintain low soil fertility. So in the case of soil fertility, the soil may be too high in the first place, and it may be that we need to look for alternative mixes, seed mixes. And in the case of removal of arisings, this presents a few challenges, as grass cutting equipment would need to have collection boxes. And although at the Charles Kennedy building, where I showed the earlier example, the local FM is going to be cutting the grass, and it's a relatively small area, but on Inches Park, it's community services that undertake the maintenance. And at the moment, there's no facility in place to collect the arisings. So then there's the question of what do we do with the arisings, what would happen to them, and if they're composted along with garden waste, are they sent out of the area for composting, which will add to transport costs? And ideally they'd be kept on site, but then we'd need the space to do that. And then there's the possibility of community composting, but this would it need to meet the requirements of PAS 100 to ensure quality and that it's fit for purpose. And then, as I mentioned, switching to a less intensive green space management can reduce energy costs and reduce emissions. And a study was carried out by the Woodland Trust a few years back, which looked at maintenance costs of different regimes. And as you would expect, amenity grass is more expensive to maintain than meadow or rough grassland due to the frequency of cuts. So, as I mentioned, because Inches Park is a new park, there are many opportunities to include some interventions highlighted to deliver low carbon solutions. So whilst the park has a master plan, it probably should be reviewed in respect of climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. The production of a park strategy and management plan would act as a framework for action, as well as a tool for accessing funding for future projects. And there's also opportunities to trial projects as potential exemplars to roll out to other council green spaces. So finally, I hope this presentation will help to start a dialogue with colleagues from other services on how we can take forward some of the interventions we have looked at today, and also how we might work together in overcoming the challenges to progress. And as an authority, I think we need to recognise that design and maintenance are intrinsically linked, and that more needs to be done to support projects achieve their goals in the long term by adapting a more holistic approach. So thank you for your time today. I hope it's given you some insight into the work that's been undertaken by our service. That's all.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and I'm sure we agree with you. Everybody loves to see the pictures of the wildflower meadows, but when it comes to, but this is how we have to do it, and this is how we're going to maintain it. There's always obstacles to be overcome, and it very much seems to be that these obstacles are impossible to overcome. But we'd certainly like to promote that a bit further, because it certainly looks really good. Yeah, as long as we can get it cut in the autumn. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think. Obviously we've talked to community services about this in the past, but I think it's going to have to be an ongoing dialogue to try and make some progress. And
you know, we do have a lot of projects, a lot of the school projects, especially without external consultants that are involved, often specify wildflower meadows. But, you know, if we're not able to carry on the maintenance regime, then it just falls apart, you know, after the first couple of years. So I'm hoping we can try and do something about that. So I think we as councillors really need to promote the idea of a trial area to get them started. Yeah. And once they realise it does bring its own benefits, and perhaps we'll make some progress. Councillor Fraser wants to come in on this too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sonia. That's a really useful presentation. There's a lot of points that you could pick up on, but I'll just pick up on the one that was in there, which was site-specific interventions. Now, the Scottish Government have the pollinator strategy, which runs for 10 years, which I would think would be within your auspices there. I put a link to a book in the chat there, Sting in the Tail, by Dave Coulson. He set up the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and I found a lot of useful information there. When I had, this is just a brief background, when I had an allotment in Cromarty, the allotment had been a tennis court, which had been basically a tar court, and over the years it just become brambles and rosebay willow herb. So when I took over my portion, I realised that the soil was going to be impoverished. So what I just did, I left it fallow for the year, and just through copious amounts of wildflower seed, the plot was just a riot of actual colour. The following year, I made a big mistake. I fertilised it, and wildflowers reduced by half, and the following year they went down by half again. So the wildflower meadows should be on, I think, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, impoverished soil.
Yeah.
So there's areas where the Highland Council will have areas that are not suitable for a great many things, and if we look to convert them to wildflower areas, we can save ourselves a lot of time in continual maintenance of that. So that was the only thing I was going to say. There was it's a knowledge thing for many people, that they think throwing fertilizer onto a plot to get wildflowers is going to be beneficial. It doesn't. A lot of these wildflowers produce their own nitrogen, and within that book, the guy there, the author, he bought a serious amount of acres over in France, and found that the problem was when he started to fertilize it, the amount of wildflowers reduced by half continually. And it took him a while to get that solved. And we also have verge maintenance, and a lot of our verges do not need to be trimmed. They don't need to be cut unless they're in sight lines. And we need to, that guidance is a number of years old. I still have the original booklet, much to the annoyance of some of my council colleagues, because I keep bringing this up and say, why aren't we following our own guidance from the other year? So that's all I was going to say on the site-specific interventions there, because what you've basically said is the knowledge I've gained over the years just by my own experience.
Yeah, painful lesson to learn there, Keith. Craig. Sonia?
Yeah, I think that's one of the constraints is the soil fertility as well. And like I said, that we need to look at what other seed mixes are out there. And I think one thing I've been trialing myself as well is yellow rattle in grass, to try and make, you know, it knocks back the vigor of the grass. So I have been trying that, and I wondered if that's maybe something that we could do as well. But it's just, then it's a long-term plan. I think with yellow rattle it can take 2 or 3 years to knock back the grass sufficiently, and then as it opens up the grass, then you can start adding more, you know, wildflower mixes into it as well. So it would be good to try something like that as well, I think, on some of their sites. Yeah.
But persuasion needed to get it started.
Yeah.
Please.
I have a personal view about most wildflower meadow seed. great bird food, because I just don't think they're often adapted for what you want. Go and look at the Dawes roundabout this summer. I don't know who does it in community services. I must find out and give him a wreath of laurels, because he's very good, and I suspect it is a he, although I might be surprised. He has a wildflower roundabout every year, and it looks great. It's got a Nessie in it, of course, which does add to its attractions. And he's got a real opportunity this year, because we let the other roundabouts on the West Link get into such a state that they've actually been taken down by weed killer. They'll actually be in a reasonable condition to think about wildflower meadows. I'm predominantly interested in growing wildflower seeds in cells and planting out. That's an intensive job, and I understand that. And you've got all this potential composting to go on there. What you need around there is someone who knows what they're doing, and can actually do some real interventions. And I think if I had Inches Park in my ward, I'd be looking to raise the money to pay someone to actually do some of this work, and to keep on top of it over the years until it becomes established. Once it's established, it's good, but you can spend a lot of time and energy and frustration on the early years of establishing wildflower meadows, and they're very variable. You get a wet one, and I've got folks in my backyard here who have got damp meadows, and they are the most wonderful thing in the summer, full of orchids and ragged robin and other plants. And it's about your soil, and it's not altogether about fertility, high or low. That's part of it, but it's about the conditions of it, and what you can grow. And it's very localized, but whoever does the Dawes roundabout is an artist. You need to find that person, plug it into more, and encourage the local members at Inches to get some money together and actually employ someone to do some of this work, then it'll happen.
Good idea, Councillor Davison, and we'll leave that to Councillor McPherson to take it to his ward colleagues and further that little experiment. Sonia.
Yeah, I think that community services are doing some annual mixes on the roundabouts, but I'm not sure if they're doing the Dawes roundabout. I'd have to ask them. I'm not sure if it's them or not. So they're having to do, you know, they're reseeding it every year basically. And I suppose it's a small area, but it's where we get into bigger areas, you know, such as Inches Park, that it becomes a bit more of an issue of how we would tackle it, I think. So.
And the last councillor on this one will be Councillor McLean, please. Angela?
Sorry, am I still on mute? Sorry. That was really interesting, and I wondered, I've noticed, especially in my own area, and I'm sure it's happening elsewhere, more and more community groups are getting involved in this and setting them up, as you were saying. And we've talked about in some of our council house estates about trying to do up some of the outdoor areas. Should they be coming to you and your colleague, Sonia, beforehand to talk about it, rather than just putting in the usual couple of rose bushes and a few flowers? Should we be coming to you, you know, when we're doing this environmental maintenance?
Well, that's a good question. Because it's, you know, the projects that we're generally working on are, you know, we're time charged, so there's the issue with that. But I suppose, you know, for a bit of advice here and there, it wouldn't be a problem. But if it's a specific project that, you know, they're setting up and they've got funding for, then I suppose that's a different thing. But for a bit of advice, you know, it doesn't take very long, then yeah, that would be perfectly okay.
Thank you, Sonia. I don't have any other members, so thank you very much for your presentation, and I'm sure some of us will be in touch looking for that little gems of advice as we go forward. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, members, we've had a good discussion on that, and let's hope we can bring some of it forward. We're on to item 5 now, landscapes as carbon sinks, and Joe Perry's going to lead us on this one.
Okay,
Joe?
hi there, everyone. So I just want to start by saying another thank you to Bill and Katrina, who did our first 2 presentations, because they've also been really, really generous with their time, helping me to think about blue carbon and support some projects that we're hopefully going to get started really soon. So hopefully you can all see my presentation coming up now. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Joe Perry and I'm the Climate Change Coordinator for the Council. Today I'm going to give an overview of the Landscapes as Carbon Sinks project, which the Council has been involved in for about 6 months. So in brief, this is a project which intends to harness blended finance at scale for sustainable landscapes, which help us to meet our net zero ambitions, and that will all become a bit clearer as we go on. So first of all, who is involved? There's unprecedented political, financial and public support for building a low carbon economy, and this support is reflected in a diverse working group and well-resourced project. The Landscapes as Carbon Sinks project is jointly led by the University of Edinburgh's Centre for Sustainable Forests and Landscapes, the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation, and works closely with the Scottish Government and a range of other partners in Scotland and across Europe. The project is also supported by the European Institute of Technology through the Climate Kick programme, which is called Landscapes as Carbon Sinks Deep Demonstration. The local partner, this is how the council got involved, the local partner for the project is the Peatlands Partnership, which is also leading on the Flow Country World Heritage Site project, which is important later on. The council sits on the Peatlands Partnership alongside organisations such as Nature Scot, UHI, HIE, the RSPB, Forestry and Land Scotland, the Federation of Small Businesses and a number of others. The initiative that we're talking about today brings together research, policy development, business innovation and land management expertise to focus on the delivery of low carbon economies and landscapes. Now, this is a 10-year project and we're right at the beginning here, so some of the terms and phrases will seem a little bit general right now. So just giving a background to the project, the motivation for this approach to landscape work came from the recognition that there is a gap in the financing of large-scale conservation projects, particularly those projects which are at landscape scale. Filling this gap would allow work which would be aligned with national strategies, deliver multiple sustainable development goals, enable landscape scale action, build synergies between sectors, trigger private finance and operate over a length of time which makes sense for our changing climate. The Landscape Finance Lab, which is another leading partner in this project, I know there are a lot of partners, already has 6 similar projects up and running worldwide, each of which is expected to bring in at least $100 million of investment over its lifetime. The peatlands of Caithness and Sutherland were chosen at this time as a result of the profile raising of the World Heritage Site project for the Flow Country, along with a growing recognition that the carbon sequestered and stored in peatlands is an important component of reaching carbon net neutrality. After this area was selected, that's when the Peatlands Partnership was identified as a good local partner, as it's made up of organisations with a high level of expertise and local contacts. Projects such as this one, which are run by the same European partners involved in our Landscape as Carbon Sinks, are already up and running, as I mentioned earlier, and they're having an impact in other parts of the world. And just a couple of really quick examples here. So in Finland, the forests are being managed more responsibly for raw materials in areas where this project is running. So for not just raw materials, but food and ecosystem services such as flood prevention and carbon sequestration, the introduction of new technologies and appropriate training for local people to use this technology has also reduced waste and allowed employees of the forestry sector to diversify. And then in Slovakia, there's a similar approach which has helped the forestry sector to move from a wasteful and unproductive linear economy to a more inclusive and circular economy, which is better for the environment and for the local workforce and communities. So I think we can take confidence from the success that this European team has had elsewhere and believe that similar success can be brought here to the Highlands. So if we're talking about the location of the project, this is one of the main challenges we found at the start of the Landscapes as Carbon Sinks project. Where do you draw the boundary line? And you might have heard me talk to you about this before with the World Heritage Site. There's no defined boundary for the flow country. So for the early conversations, we shared these two maps with the Landscapes as Carbon Sinks project. These are the maps we took out to consultation when we were doing the World Heritage Site project. The map on the left shows the areas of core and often deep peatland, and those are the areas in blue, and areas of other habitat, which could be forestry, steep-sided hills or developed areas, and those are the bits in green. The map on the right shows the existing designations for peatland in the area. These are the sites of special scientific interest, special areas of conservation, and Ramsar sites. So it's just to give people an idea of where the deep peat is and where the protection already lies. So the Landscapes as Carbon Sinks project has taken a really similar boundary line after seeing these maps. The boundary line is the red line going on the outside. The only addition is that it's also going to include the small patch of peatland up by John O'Groats, which you can see on the map on the right. So that red line is going to extend a bit further towards the coast. So there are three key aims of the Landscape as Carbon Sinks project, and these aims might develop as we go through our consultation and find out more about what local people really want from it. So firstly, to develop a landscape programme with climate resilient supply chains to accelerate landscape approaches. Secondly, to attract green finance from local, national and international investors who want to use their money to support sustainable and productive landscapes and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And thirdly, the results and the lessons learned from this project will be shared with the global landscape community, because when it comes to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions hurt all of us, no matter where they're coming from. As I mentioned earlier, an overarching theme of this project is frequent and meaningful engagement with local people. It's not just limited to landowners and land managers. It will also involve going into schools when that's possible and attending community council meetings to ask people about their future vision for the flow country. So perhaps the most substantial output of this project so far has been the Flow Country 2045 Vision Workshop, which is summarised in the briefing note you've all received, and you can check the main outcomes in that briefing note, or I can share the full report if anyone's interested. The workshop featured 25 stakeholders representing 13 different sectors and focused on three themes. The first of those themes was the multiple benefits that the landscape could have in 2045 for the environment and for the people. Secondly, the landscape features which were required to support these benefits, such as healthy peatlands. And thirdly, the initiatives we need to focus on in the near term to reach that shared vision. As I said, I can circulate the full report, but I just wanted to highlight one of the interesting outcomes which we had, which was that the top three initiatives considered to be at the heart of achieving the 2045 vision for the flow country were the development of carbon payments, sustainable land use, which takes advantage of local expertise, and attracting natural capital investment. So the original timeline for this project has been pushed back slightly due to the pandemic restrictions, but the timelines that you'll see in your briefing note remain largely the same. The past year saw numerous online workshops and partnership meetings between representatives of the Peatlands Partnership, the wider Landscape as Carbon Sinks team and members of the public. This coming year will see a shift in priority, if the pandemic allows, to designing the specific approaches required in the flow country and doing some on-the-ground work. These approaches will be to help us make changes to landscape greenhouse gas emissions and produce a more sustainable economy. This could be in the form of creating new business models or identifying innovative financing mechanisms such as carbon credits, bringing about new technologies or land management approaches. From the end of this year on to 2030, these approaches, which we've decided on, will be put into place, measured and analysed. The project will then be tested for its societal, environmental and economic impact, with the overall aim of bringing about net zero carbon in a way which could be replicated in other areas. So one thing we learned from the World Heritage Site project is how diverse the communities of the area are. Not everyone is going to have the same vision for the landscape, and not everyone will agree that our priority should be reducing carbon emissions or fighting climate change. So we hope to overcome this challenge through regular and meaningful community engagement, some of which has already begun in formats such as the workshop I mentioned earlier. Climate change itself offers a challenge to the project, as we can expect more frequent extreme weathers. This increases the risk of flooding or fires, such as those that we saw in late 2019. The flow country is fortunate in that it has more eyes on it now than ever before. The University of Highlands and Islands has been embarking on regular and in-depth monitoring of peatland condition in this area for many years, and will continue to do so. As part of the World Heritage Site project, the Peatlands Partnership is going to produce a management plan which encourages the kinds of land management which support the outstanding universal value of the flow country, which is the blanket bog habitat. Attracting finance is a challenge which underpins everything. The other projects undertaken by the organisations involved have required different approaches to attracting investment, and this is something that will be worked out over the coming year. So there are many possible benefits of this project, and they will be to an extent determined by the feedback from the community consultation that we'll be doing over the coming year. The likely benefits, however, could include a stronger and more circular local economy, a boost to ecotourism and slow tourism, the development of green investor networks with an interest in the region, an increase in biodiversity and bioabundance, healthier blanket bog, which is sequestering and storing more carbon and providing a home to rare and endangered species, and that the agricultural community feels listened to and is confident that their views have helped to shape the project, and also that the project can be used as a prototype for other similar landscapes in Scotland, the UK and beyond. And I just wanted to finish by drawing the connection between low carbon landscapes and our work to meet the climate and ecological emergency, even though it probably seems quite obvious. So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, which is a gas that absorbs and radiates heat. Unlike oxygen or nitrogen, greenhouse gases like carbon absorb heat from the sun and release it gradually over time, like stones in a fire after the fire goes out. Man-made increases in greenhouse gases have now tipped the Earth out of balance, trapping additional heat and raising the average temperature. The carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere are rising mostly due to the fossil fuels that we burn for energy. However, there are also significant emissions from the land. Taking peatlands such as the flow country as an example, while wet and undisturbed blanket bog is a remarkable sequester and store of carbon, dried out, drained or trampled bog can be a net emitter of carbon and other greenhouse gases. By managing our landscapes with carbon and climate change in mind, we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions and increase the amount of carbon locked away in the peat. And unlike with trees, which lock carbon away for a couple of hundred years at best, the peatlands can lock carbon away for thousands of years. So we're very much at the early stages of this project, and I hope I can give you more updates at future meetings. But for now, thanks very much for listening, and do get in touch if you want to find out more about the project or if you want to see the full working group report. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That's very interesting. It's good to see this take another step forward, and we'll look forward to hearing more updates in the future. Members, do you have any questions for Joe? Councillor Fraser?
Yeah, it's just on the Ramsar Secretariat. Are we in direct contact with them? Because the easiest way, most people have not heard of the Ramsar Secretariat. They don't know what it is. They think it's an acronym, which it isn't. And the way I remember it, it's basically an international convention for the protection of wetland and the life that lives in it and on it. And that's all I need to remember. And if anybody wants to know, I'll say go and Google this. I'll put the link. I'll put the link to the Ramsar Convention in the chat. But they're basically, for people that don't know about Ramsar, it actually tells you everything you really need to know and reinforces what we're trying to do as a local authority. I do wonder that because we have a number of Ramsar sites in our local area, obviously up in the flow country, but we also have down at the bottom of the Black Isle in Udall Bay. And so it actually spreads far and wide. And so that was the only comment I was going to make. It's the fact that people don't know what Ramsar is. And I think once they start to understand that and why it's so important, and I just wondered if we do have links to them, because I have spoken to them before on a number of occasions.
Do we have these links in place, Joe?
We do. So we went back and forth quite a lot in the build up to the World Heritage Site project, because it was a big part of our argument for why we are confident that we could continue to protect the flow country in the future, which was one of the criteria for getting to the next stage of World Heritage Site. And the same people are on the working group for the landscape as carbon sinks. There's about half of the World Heritage Site working group are on this one as well. So I think everyone within our group is well aware of it. And when we went out to consultation for the World Heritage Site project, we took those Ramsar maps out and we did try and talk about what they are, why they're important, and why it's something that we're really shouting about. But yes, I completely take your point. Most people wouldn't know what it was.
It's a good start here anyway. Councillor Davidson.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joe. Right, 2 or 3 things. First of all, Joe, if you could reflect on, I mean, whatever we do, we're going to get at least a 1.5 degree temperature rise, and heaven forfend we get it too much further than that. But how is that going to affect the flow country? And I am taking it that your plans that are being put forward by the landscape partnership, this whole partnership, are actually got that at its centre, because we do have to protect. It's much easier to say, oh well, we'll block some drains, we'll make some more wet areas, but I do feel that we've got a real protection job to do here, and to use it as an exemplar for where else we can do this in Highland, because many of us live with peat in our backyard. I think the whole of Loch Harbour qualifies when I last looked. So there's a big issue there for me. The other thing is to be ambitious enough with this. Let's not just do nice landscape things. Let's not just enable other people to do it. I'm extremely keen that the council takes its role here as an enabler very, very strongly. And perhaps we actually start, I don't so much making money for ourselves, that would be good, but actually find ways that we can attract money that we can invest in the local communities here and further afield, as we do it afield. And to do that, we need staff who understand money, big money, because that's what it's going to take here, and are really good at pulling the money in. The other day, Joe, you and I had a meeting with the Scottish Cities Alliance, and Rosanna Cunningham was there. They're wanting to throw money at peatland management. And for goodness sakes, we need to get there and soak some of it up, a lot of it up. Because what struck me, we started talking about COP26, and to me, it's a no-brainer. We've got to be there somewhere. We've got to be talking about landscape and about peat and all the rest. But by crikey, the cities were straight through the wire saying this has got to include the cities. It's got to be about what we do in our cities. Well, of course it has. But the big difference is going to be at landscape scale and what we can do. And I just feel we've got a real enabling role here. And it may be at arm's length from the council. This needs to just get on, and it needs to be able to make money if that's what it needs to do. And to do that, you need a certain amount of freeing up to do. So I would be very keen that we look at some sort of investment model. I'm not an investment banker, never will be, never could be, but I do admire their style on occasions when it's done for the wider good. And this is the opportunity here that I really do feel we've got. And then also to commend you on your approach to talking to the locals a lot. The flow country sits surrounded by not just communities, by North Coast 500, whoosh up and whoosh over and whoosh down. And the opportunities here to turn what we're doing into a major tourist attraction do exist. But if we do that before we've convinced most of the locals that it's a good idea, we're doomed. So we absolutely have to put that early years thinking in there and employ locals. That is also my recommendation. Employ some locals. You need some damn fine Caithness accents up there, showing folks around, with subtitles if needed, but showing folks around. Just some comments on what you're doing. I think this is of enormous central importance, what we hope to achieve. Very pleased to see it. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. And in terms of financing, that's the largest part of this project, is finding a finance model for keeping carbon locked away. This is the main purpose of what we're doing and how that plays into the local economy. But I'll go just in order of the things that you mentioned. In terms of protecting the flow country from the effects of climate change, there are maps which show peatland retreat as the climate warms, and it's really, really scary as you watch it just retreating north. And actually the flow country is going to be one of the last bastions, and which is incredibly sad, but it's the reason why the flow country is being considered for World Heritage Site status. It's the best protected, and in 50 years it's still going to be the best in the world. So that's why we're shouting about the flow country so much. In terms of protecting it from the effects of climate change, the best thing that we can do is keep it in healthy condition. So it is the on the ground stuff, which will be done by local people, blocking ditches, talking to local landowners and trying to get better management of that land. Also maybe trying to keep deer numbers down, although that's not maybe as big a problem as some of the others. Secondly, in terms of attracting money, it also reminded me of the meeting we were in with SSE. And you mentioned trying to get more money from the renewable energy companies who are operating in the area for restoring the peatland around those wind farm sites. And it does seem like that's an easy win. So that might be part of the conversation that we're having with Landscapes.
Why do you think I tried to embarrass them the other day, Joe? I hope they're an easy target.
Well, I'm sure it will come up in our project, that talking to the renewable energy companies. And also, yes, so a lot of money being thrown through peatland action into peatland restoration. And I think a role that we could play is making landowners aware of the funding that's available. As part of the World Heritage Site project, I wrote to every landowner, and I'm often writing to Europe or London or Edinburgh, that the landowners are not maybe on the ground themselves. Maybe they have a land manager who manages a few different bits. And so just making sure they know what they can claim. I think that would be a big part of it, and also keeping an eye out for any new subsidies which are maybe a bit greener than previous subsidies were. So it might be slightly different from just the normal payments for blocking ditches. There might be a few interesting environmental subsidies which we can take advantage of. And in the last one there about the NC 500 and the tourists, green tourism, slow tourism, I think it's absolutely a good opportunity. A lot of people are driving through the flow country, or well, past the flow country, to get to Orkney, to get to the World Heritage Site up there. And soon they could be driving past another World Heritage Site. And we've just got to let people know what there is to see. And then we've got to be very, very careful about where we direct the traffic, because not everywhere in the flow country can take the traffic. So hopefully I answered all your points there, Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. No other members' hands up. So Joe, I just thank you for that report, and we look forward to hearing progress as it goes along. Thank you. So members, now you have a report in front of you, item 6, on the strategic control plan for the climate change and energy team, and Keith will give us a bit of an explanation on this, please. So over to you, Keith. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try to be brief, members. Members, the background to this paper is fairly straightforward. It became clear upon taking up my new position as the Climate Change and Energy Team Manager that there wasn't really a very well-rounded understanding of what the Climate Change and Energy Team should be delivering, which was fairly understandable given that the teams merged in the late summer during the middle of a pandemic. But in addition, we didn't really have much access to funding which could help shape the Council's overall approach to net zero. And it also goes without saying that both energy and climate change are huge focus areas in their own right, and that has potentially raised expectations of what the team should and could be doing in delivering against both those agendas. So as a result of all that, we decided to develop a strategic control plan, which had been successfully used for the EV infrastructure programme, as you'll remember, as was reported back in September, to support the implementation of a more structured approach to what the team does and delivers going forward, but whilst also helping us to secure external funds and support delivery of essential zero carbon infrastructure for the council. Now, shortly after I took up my new role at the start of November, we held a vision setting workshop with senior officers to discuss past performance and a vision of where we can add most value to the net zero agenda, where we'd like to get to, and the values the team should be aspiring to, but also where our key areas of focus should lie. And following that workshop, the project team, which included Martin MacDonald and Jackie Sayer, wrote up the outcomes into an outlined strategic control plan, which I then discussed with the wider team. And following those engagement sessions, the plan was revised to better reflect the wider team's views, and the paper in front of you today sets out the current version of that plan. Now, fundamentally, the plan tries to strike the right balance between being ambitious and being pragmatic to ensure that my team are focused on the projects or objectives that are most likely and closely aligned with the overall vision. We're looking to focus the resources that we have on what we know we can do and what we know will result in the biggest carbon and cost benefits to the council, whilst continuing to deliver positive outcomes for Highland residents through programmes like the Energy Efficient Scotland Area-Based Scheme. And I'd just like to reiterate at this point that this is very much a vision and a plan for the team rather than a vision for the wider organisation. But I hope that it clearly sets out to members how we can help the council deliver against its net zero requirements. And it is worth reinforcing that this will very much remain a live document which will be amended and updated based on the shifting organisational priorities. But I am happy to take any questions on the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Councillor Loudon, you've got the first question.
Hello, Keith. I'm pretty much done. It's Friday afternoon, and it's quite far down the agenda as well. So, yeah, thanks for the paper. I think what I'm looking for is just a little bit of reassurance. I've got a clear vision of the things that you intend to focus on. The two things that I'd like some reassurance on, when all the work we did with the commercial board, which you know has kind of passed on a bit. Some of that I'd maybe hope to see as in the sort of the action plan here, if you like, for the things that you'd be focusing on. You know, I've always had a view that if electricity is costing us 15 pence a kilowatt hour and we can produce it ourselves for 5, then that's one of the things that we should focus on. But also the second element of that is the sort of strengthening community side. And can we help? I've got one community in my ward which may have the opportunity to invest in a wind farm. That was one of the things that the commercial board considered, and I hope that that's something that will still be under consideration here. I was a bit concerned, and there was a paper produced not so long ago that seemed to imply that climate change was a threat and not an opportunity. You know, and I look at the Highlands and I see climate change and the response to it as being an opportunity. You know, that there are things that we can do that many other areas won't be able to do. And I want to see the communities being strengthened and the council being strengthened as a result of the work we do in dealing with this.
Thank you. Keith?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Loudon. Happy to pick up on both of those points. I think, fundamentally what we're trying to do with the team is reshape it in a way which means that we're facilitating the right interventions as best we can as a team. So making sure that where there are opportunities for renewable deployment across the estate that's going to reduce our overall impact and reduce costs, we're able to explore them better and help facilitate that transition, bring in the funding that's going to support that as well. So just to give you that reassurance, that will be a fundamental focus area for the team going forward. But over and above that, the strengthening communities thing is something that I think is fundamentally important and has been missed. I'll be quite open and frank about that. The capacity of the team over the years has not been sufficient to do that level of engagement with communities. But what I'm hoping now is that we've got recruitment underway for the 2 climate change coordinator posts. I'd very much like the maternity cover post that we're recruiting to be focused in on that side of things almost exclusively over the piece, to make sure that we're capturing the ideas and the needs of communities and build up the right types of projects that are going to benefit not just the communities but the council more widely. So that is something that is in the plans. It's there within the strategic control plan, but it is something you'll see a lot more action on the ground over the coming weeks and months, and I'll be happy to bring a report back to the group in the future about that.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Yeah, we're beginning to see movement at last. It's not just talk now, we're beginning to see some action happening, members. It's wonderful. Councillor Davidson?
Just something I've said before and we'll say again: communication. How we talk to the world, how we talk to our communities. If we don't have them with us, we're just whistling into the wind. I'm really keen that enough attention is paid to that, and that needs to be somebody's job.
Yes, indeed. Keith?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think having that community liaison will give us that benefit. We'll be able to develop a communications plan as part of the wider net zero strategy as well, because fundamentally, if we're going to achieve, it's one thing to achieve a net zero council. It's a very different thing to achieve a net zero region. You can't do that without winning hearts and minds and taking people on that journey with us. So the communications aspect of that net zero plan will be a hugely important part of it. And having the bigger resource available now and that slightly expanded climate change aspect of the team is really, really important. We're now able to direct a bit of that towards the work we haven't been able to do previously and highlight the good work that's going on elsewhere in the region, because it isn't just about the council delivering against this agenda. It's much, much wider than that. And I think part of it is making those links, making those networks to expedite that delivery on the ground. And I very much see the merit and the benefit in getting out there and speaking to communities along the lines of the conversation we've already started in Skye and Rassay. It helps us to understand where the opportunities are and those wide-scale decarbonisation opportunities, the likes of the hydrogen opportunities that the region is going to be presented with, and the benefits that will flow from that at community level are huge. So yeah, I completely understand and can give you the assurance it's a firm part of plans.
Yeah, not to mention our food growing ambitions. Councillor Fraser?
Yes, just to pick up on what Derek and Keith said, this is a major and huge opportunity for our local area. We do have challenges of, say, our rurality and population density, but it's actually an asset. If you go down to the Central Belt or major conurbations in England and what have you, they have different advantages to what we have, and we have a huge natural advantage that they would only dream of. And I think, as it's been said before, that the Scottish Government are looking to throw money at specific ideas. So we would be, for my mind, and I'm sure Keith and the team are looking at targeted requests to the Scottish Government on specific areas, because if that pot is relatively large, then due to being the size of Belgium or Wales, we should have a commensurate potential to actually dip into that on a very positive level, because what we can deliver as an area to the net zero goal we are just ideally placed, and we should make every opportunity, because if we don't ask, we don't get, and it'll go to somebody else.
Indeed. Keith, do you have a last comment?
Yeah, just on that point, I think I've made the point before, and it's a point well made, Councillor Fraser. But without the contribution of Highland, we're not getting to net zero as a country. So we do play a disproportionately large role in that ambition, and I think it is certainly part of the emerging vision under NPF4 and our indicative regional spatial strategy, that recognition that we will, you know, support and have that fundamentally important role in Scotland achieving its overall ambition, and certainly it is part of the wider team's aims and aspirations to make the absolute most of those opportunities. So yeah, I hope that gives some confidence.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you very much. So thank you to all the presenters today. We're just about out of time, but we've kept within time for a change. So that's been very good. So thank you all, and thank you members for your attendance today and your contributions.